The committee will come to order. We exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. It is our job to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. Today's hearing will focus on the GAO's third annual report on areas of duplication within the Federal Government. The GAO is our key partner in eliminating waste, fraud, and abuse and providing transparency and an honest, nonpartisan view of government and its spending. In the past, the GAO has made almost 300 recommendations among 131 issue areas to Congress and to the executive branch to reduce cost, duplication, fractured and overlapping programs. As of today, sadly, only 16 of 131 have been fully addressed. However, to be timely, just tomorrow we expect the President's budget to have a number of these addressed. Perhaps sequestration was the impetus, perhaps simply a fifth year of a presidency. But as budget pressure increases and the American taxpayer says, I cannot afford to buy the same services twice, both Congress, including the GAO, and the executive branch must find these programs, must find this waste, and must do our job differently. One of the things that this report cannot do is it cannot talk about the pure inefficiency of branches thinking separately. Even when there is not pure duplication, ultimately every part of government, every administrative part, at least 26 different entities, buy separately, think separately, staff separately, and have separate executives to do substantially the same work. I am pleased that the committee has already been responsive to the GAO's nonpartisan recommendations. Several of the cost recommendations addressed by the GAO were addressed in the Federal Information Technology Acquisition Reform Act that was unanimously voted out of this committee last month. IT procurement is a classic example that I believe all of us on the dais and all of us in America can understand. The buying of computers, the buying of software to meet the basic needs of communication and of contact with the public and database management is in fact the same both in and out of government for the most part, and certainly the same within government. If we implement this and other harmonizing programs, we can save many of the dollars that the Comptroller General will speak of today. But only a thorough reorganization of government will in fact prevent these from happening again. My first question today to our witness will be just that. Isn't it inherent within our government that as long as we have individual budgets, individual authority, individual freedoms by cabinet positions and bureaucrats, won't they inherently try to build their organizations? Not because they are evil, not because they choose to waste money, but because ultimately it is their career. We need to change that. We need to create a career path in government that says where you are in government and what you do in government do not have to be based on protecting your own bureaucracy. Congress must focus on this, and I am delighted to say that with the President's pre-announcement of as much as $25 billion addressed by the GAO and others, we will in fact for the first time see a budget that dramatically reduces duplication. As I said earlier, this isn't enough, and fundamental change must be in Congress's hands, and we must rise to that occasion. And with that, I would like to recognize the Ranking Member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for holding this very important hearing. And I want to thank you, Mr. Dodaro, for being here to testify about GAO's findings. Today's hearing will examine GAO's latest annual report on duplication in Federal programs and opportunities for significant cost savings. And before I go on, let me, Mr. Dodaro, thank you and your hardworking staff for the excellent work that you all do. So often Federal employees do not get the credit that they are due, but the integrity and the excellent work that you all put out is a real benefit to not only the Congress, but the people of the United States of America. And I just want to make sure I say that. Hearings like this one provide an important opportunity to identify ways to cut government waste, save money, and make our taxpayer dollars go further. But holding hearings is not enough. Congress must follow up with concrete action to save the taxpayers' money. GAO issued 2 of these reports previously in 2011 and 2012, and GAO made 300 specific recommendations to the executive branch and the Congress. This year's report provides a status update on those recommendations, and it finds that Congress is doing a much poorer job than the executive branch in implementing these recommendations. Specifically, GAO finds that the executive branch has fully or partially addressed 80% of their recommendations, but Congress has fully or partially addressed only 32% of their recommendations. This is a poor record that Congress should strive to correct. In this year's report, GAO highlights 11 areas of unimplemented recommendations from its previous reports that, if implemented, would save billions of dollars. 7 out of 11 areas would require congressional action, but so far Congress has failed to act. For example, in previous reports, GAO found that the Federal Government could save up to $2 billion over the next 10 years if Congress authorized the Department of Interior to revise the royalty rates for oil and gas revenues in the Gulf of Mexico. But Congress has failed to act on this recommendation. As a result, it is listed yet again in the GAO's report for 2013. GAO's new report also identifies additional ways our government can save money. For example, according to GAO, if Congress limited its subsidies for crop insurance, it would save up to $1.2 billion a year. GAO found that agencies could save billions of dollars by improving oversight over their information technology investments. And GAO also found that agencies could save millions of dollars by using cloud computing. It seems to me that this is one hearing in which Democrats and Republicans can join forces to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. I shall never forget, Mr. Dodaro, when I was first ran for Congress and was 15 points behind, and I hired this guy to manage my campaign. And he said, although you're 15 points behind, and the race was only a 2-month race, he said, always remember this. He says, most people know what to do. They know the plan, but they don't execute it. He said, if you execute the plan, you're going to win. And I won by 15 points. And so I think this is about coming up with a plan and trying to execute it, make it happen. So whether you believe the savings should go towards deficit reduction or making our current government programs more effective and efficient, we should all be able to agree that a dollar wasted here is a dollar that is not put to better use elsewhere. I think Republicans and Democrats will agree that we want to see the taxpayers' dollars spent in an effective and efficient manner. Mr. Dodaro, I look forward to hearing your testimony, including specific recommendations to cut waste and save the government money. I would also appreciate your guidance on steps we can take to remove some of these long-standing recommendations from your list, so we are not here again in 2014 asking the same questions. And as I said a little earlier, I compliment your staff, but we also want them to feel that we're doing what they have suggested that we do after all of their hard work. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Members may have 7 days to submit opening statements for the record. We now have the honor of welcoming our primary witness and the ladies and gentlemen he brought with him. The first witness is the Honorable Gene Dodaro. He is Comptroller General of the United States. We are also pleased to welcome several experts from the United States Government Accountability Office that will be with him here today, and would ask that they also rise to be sworn in a minute. To recognize, I'd like to recognize, though, specifically, and there may be others, but Ms. Janet St. Laurent. She is the Managing Director of Defense Capabilities and Management. Mr. Joel Williamson is Managing Director of Information Technology. Mr. Mark Gaffigan is Managing Director of Natural Resources and Environment, and Ms. Kathleen Barrick is Managing Director of Homeland Security and Justice. Will those individuals and anyone else who may provide information to the Comptroller General please rise to take the oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm, or would you please raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Gene, you've been here so many times, it's almost crazy to say, look at the lights. Your statements are always sufficiently short, and our questions are always long. So your entire opening statement will be placed in the record, and you're recognized to give your abbreviated opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Ranking Member Cummings, I appreciate your comments about our staff. Members of the committee, I'm very pleased to be here today to discuss our most recent report on ways to make government more efficient and effective. We've, in this report, highlighted 17 areas where we've focused on areas of fragmentation, overlap, or duplication in the Federal Government, and made recommendations to address these issues. For example, from 2002 until most recently, the Department of Defense has moved from 2 camouflage ground-based uniforms to up to 7, so that they're service-based purchases rather than joint purchases, thereby foregoing the opportunity for tens of millions of dollars of savings, but also importantly from ensuring equivalent protection of service members during joint operations. We've made recommendations to address that issue. Also, in the Medicaid program, which is an area where there's a large amount of improper payments, billions of dollars a year, the Department of Health and Human Services, CMS, has taken a number of actions. However, we pointed out one action where they actually hired 2 contractors for every State, one to review the data to decide which claims to audit, and another contractor to audit the claims. We said that's inefficient, duplicative, one contractor will do. Then also in the area of geospatial or mapping information, there are billions of dollars spent every year by the Federal Government to buy this information, and it's been well reported that there are duplicative investments. And so we've focused on recommendations to ensure more effective coordination of a joint committee that's focused on these activities. It needs to do a better job. OMB needs to have more visibility and to be able to prevent these duplicative investments, and it needs to become a priority. In this case, Mr. Cummings, they have a plan. It's not executed, Mr. Chairman, and it's not a priority. And it's got to be both, and thereby reaping benefits of millions of dollars in this area. Now, we also identify 14 other areas where there are opportunities for cost savings and revenue enhancements. And cost savings, we've testified before this committee on the Medicare demonstration pilot on Medicare Advantage and recommended the pilot be canceled. At the time we did that, there was possibility of saving $8.3 billion because this pilot only rewards average performing plans and is not really going to demonstrate what it's intended to demonstrate. Right now, there's still an opportunity to save $2 billion, but Congress has to act soon in order to cancel this pilot. Also, in the Medicaid area, there are billions of dollars spent in addition to reimbursements for claims in order to make sure that there's money provided for uncompensated care. We think there's not enough oversight over these areas, and there's costs being reimbursed that are well in excess of the costs that are spent to deliver those services. And this doesn't make sense. So there needs to be more transparency and accountability. We've made recommendations on the revenue side, for example. We've made a number of recommendations to the IRS in order to help close a $385 billion tax gap. There's also opportunities for the Congress to legislate in the tobacco tax area to make the tax equivalent for similar types of products. That could garner the Federal Government several hundred millions of dollars and up to a little over $1 billion a year, and make that more equitable. Now, turning to our prior reports, if I could direct your attention to the chart here. This shows the percent of actions that have been taken on the 130 recommendations we've had already. 12%, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, 16 or 12% have been acted on. 66% have been, or 87 of them, we've had partial addressment, and 21% or 27 of those actions have not been addressed at all. So there's plenty of opportunities. And the opportunities are throughout government. I'll show my last chart. This is for all 3 years. We've got 162 areas, 380 specific recommendations for action. They go across virtually every major department and agency of the Federal Government. Many of here are in Defense, HHS, and Treasury, which are about 56% of total obligations for the year. So many opportunities, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to answering your questions today and working with this committee to make government more efficient and effective on behalf of the American people.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself for a couple of a quick statement and a couple of questions. The ranking member in his opening statement mentioned raising the revenues from drilling of oil and natural gas. That's not a cost savings. He called it a cost savings. It's a tax increase, right? It's not one of your recommendations that you simply increase the percentages that you charge for royalties.
What we recommended is that the Department, there was studies showing that other entities that give those leases were gaining more revenues from the leases than the Federal Government. So we recommended that Interior conduct a study to determine whether or not it was maximizing the revenue capabilities. The study's been done, but they haven't made any recommendations.
But isn't it true that they actually don't know what they're entitled to? They're not able to properly audit how much oil or natural gas they get out. There's a huge amount of areas that have not been available for leasing. In other words, if we were to look at this as a savings, I kind of look at it as a tax or a revenue, but if we were to look at it as revenue, we would have to make these things comparable to the highest and best selling price you could find in the private sector. In other words, get at least what you would get if on private lands, recognizing that the State of Texas, for example, has rights in shallow water. So there's a comparable between the State of Texas in the State versus our offshore leases and so on. But it would be it would be Federal lands for grazing, and ultimately, wouldn't there be a return if they simply got their audit? And I know this is where you have an expert about to jump up, but right. if they did proper audit, so they actually knew what they were entitled to, and it could ensure they get 100 cents on the dollar of what they're entitled to.
Yes, and I will ask our expert, Mark, to come to the table. But there are really two issues, and we're looking at it as a revenue issue. All right, number one, right. Are we charging the right royalties in the first place? And number two, are we really getting what we're owed due to the volume and extraction of the oil? So you're exactly right.
And as you know, this committee, on a very bipartisan basis, went back and forth trying to get the revenues. There were contract failures that led to no revenues when, in fact, that wasn't the intent nor the letter of the law that Congress passed. Please, Mark.
Thank you, Chairman Issa. Yes, we enjoyed working with your staff, Larry Brady and company, on that back in the day. There's sort of three parts of this. One is sort of the product verification, and that's what you're alluding to. We have 19 recommendations we made to what was MMS and is now BOMA.
Change the names,
yes,
but they're still not doing their job,
still
right?
within the Department of Interior. They've made some progress, and that's why we address it as partially addressed. They've gotten together a committee that meets to talk about current trends in measurement, but they're missing in some other areas. For example, they really don't have real-time production data, so they can verify when things, what we're producing. The other part of it is the diligent development concern. We have leases that aren't being utilized. And there's been several proposals in Congress, and Interior's made some proposals to charge a rent for those leases that aren't being used as a motivation to seek development. And that's part of where that $2 billion potentially could come from.
Although that wouldn't be able to come under current leases. That would be part of the bid process. So wouldn't there be an offset in that if I know I might have to pay the rent in my bidding process, I might bid a little less?
Yeah, that's definitely a possibility. And but the idea is it would provide that incentive to go. And the other part is the revenue collection. We did recommend that they do some studies on what the government take was compared to others. They've done 3 of those studies, but they just haven't acted with a recommendation to either affirm what we're charging now makes sense or whether we want to adjust it up or down.
Sure. Well, I can tell you that it is a heck of a deal until you get into the regulatory time it takes to get an oil well or a natural gas well drilled sometimes. But you're absolutely right. We should try to maximize that revenue. Switching slightly, Mr. Dodaro, your previous report and this report continue to identify the IT investment. And I'm particularly interested in your view on what if I read it correctly, from 2012 still today, OMB has essentially been tasked to find out how much is being spent on IT. We recently did a hearing on this $80 billion nominal amount. But if I read correctly, what you're telling me is that it's underreported, that in fact, because they're not reporting their IT expenditures to the OMB and the OMB is not forcing them to, that in fact we may be spending more and spending it poorer. Is that a succinct way of saying it?
I'll ask Joel Willinson to come up and explain that. But I think that's a correct statement. And I also would say, Mr. Chairman, I meant in my opening statement to commend this committee for passage of the IT Acquisition Reform Act. That act touches on a number of areas that we've reported in all 3 years.
If you stop over the Senate, mention that.
I will. I'll be there next month. Joel?
Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, when OMB talks about the amount of money the Federal Government spends on IT, it is an understated figure for a variety of reasons. One is that a number of smaller independent agencies don't report this information to OMB. That's about 58 agencies. In addition, there are a number of IT projects, whether they're R&D projects or space projects, which include a huge percentage of IT that are often not reported. In addition, from a total Federal Government perspective, we're only talking about a slice of the executive branch. We're not talking about the legislative branch. We're not talking about the judicial branch. In addition, the intel area is not included. So with all of those exclusions, what's the total amount spent? Nobody knows. Is it slightly north of $100 billion annually? Probably, but we don't know for sure.
Thank you. I will mention the only thing I take away from my time on the Select Intelligence Committee is that I learned the definition of petabyte of data. So I share with you that it's a lot of procurement over there. Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. Mr. Dodaro, the more I'm in government, and now I've been here 17 years, been in the State Legislature for 14, I'm always reminded of something that my mother used to say. She said, so often you have motion, commotion, and emotion and no results. The older I get, the more I'm concerned about that, because we come here, the government spends billions of dollars for staff. You've got people working 365 a year. And the question is, how do we, you mentioned a few success stories in your opening. And and I know you want to see things implemented. Have you seen something that gives you some hope so that when you go back to your staff, you say, you know what, guys, and ladies and gentlemen, we've done some great work, and I think this is an area that we are going to see some change, because I can imagine that, and I alluded to this in my opening, that when people work hard and give it everything they've got, and then if they see the recommendations put on the shelf and turn dusty, they begin to wonder whether or not they are truly feeding their souls. In other words, a lot of people come to government because they want to make a difference, the ones I talk to. And so when they don't see those differences being made, they get frustrated and they may move on to something else. And these are great people. So I'm trying to get to bottom lines. I go back to that motion, commotion, emotion, and no results. Because, as I say to people all the time, we only have a limited amount of time on this earth and a limited amount of time in these positions. The question is, do you see something? Can you tell us something based upon the things that you've seen enacted that might help us to get there? Are you following my question?
Yes, definitely, definitely. First of all, 80% of our recommendations at GAO are implemented.
So you feel good about that?
We feel good about it.
Is that something new? Is that new?
No, that's about the average period of time. And actually, last year there were financial benefits accrued to the Federal Government over $55 billion as a result of GAO work. That's $105 for every dollar invested in GAO. So we feel good about it. Now,
but do you all have a party or anything like when you have one of these big? Seriously.
No.
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 Oh,
we just we would investigate.
We'd be investigated. That's right. You'd be investigated.
Yeah. Right. We just keep feeding our souls. We just keep going at it.
You have Donut Friday. That's the important thing.
But among that, though, I'll just give two examples of good successes related to this area. We recommended that the ethanol tax credit be looked at because it was duplicating the renewable fuel standard. Congress let that tax credit lapse, and that was about $5.7 billion in revenue losses to the Federal Government. We also recommended that DOD was planning on sending all the families of the service members over to South Korea to enable them to have more of a normal tour of duty over there. We said, that's going to cost a lot of money. Have you done a business case? They did the business case, decided against it, avoided over $3 billion that would have been spent on that activity. And there's stories like that all the time. We're here talking about some tough issues that haven't been addressed yet and need to be addressed, but be sure that the people at GAO are working hard to make sure that these things do get addressed.
I want to go back to this whole oil and gas royalties. And in that report 2 years ago, you found that the Federal Government could receive an additional $1.7 billion in oil and gas royalties over the next 10 years if the Federal Government started getting a fair market value for the leases. Is that right?
The estimate that we got from Department of Interior is $2 billion over 10 years. About $800 million would come from the rents that I spoke of, and another $1.2 billion from changes to the royalties.
And GAO has also included management of Federal oil and gas resources on its annual high-risk list for the last 3 years. Is that right?
Right. I think we put that on in 2009.
And do you get frustrated?
We stay at it. We see some progress being made. There's still some work to be done. For example, we were concerned about the reorganization, and we think they came through on that with the high-risk series. But we still think in two major areas they have some work to do, the revenue collection, which we alluded to, and as well as the human capital challenge of having the staff to be able to implement these programs.
And you all said, Mr. Dodaro, that the administration had at least partially implemented 80% of the recommendations and the Congress 32%. Is that right?
That's correct. And actually, if you look at, to put it in perspective, you just look at fully addressed, executive branch and Congress are about the same, about 20%. But if you look, the executive branch has a lot more partially addressed areas. In order to get a partially addressed in Congress, you have to get a bill at least reported out of committee. to be able to do it. So, but what you said is correct.
Now, last year, the Obama administration requested a legislative change from Congress to allow it to implement certain recommendations. The administration requested authority from Congress in its fiscal year 2012 budget request to charge $4 per acre annual fee on non-producing Federal oil and gas leases. But Congress still refused to consider legislation to implement this recommendation, according to your report. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's the basis of the estimate from Interior of almost $800 million over 10 years.
I see. I see my time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I just want to ask a clarifying question so everybody else understands what's in Congress's to do and what's in the administration's to do. We in the House, including you, have about $4.5 billion in budget. You're not talking about us saving money on our budget. When you talk about congressional, you're talking about the need to pass laws, presumably that the President would sign, and that's what's in our plate. When you talk the President, you talk about executive authority. He gets on the phone and says to the OMB director, do it. Am I correct that that's?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's
okay.
Exactly
and I think the gentleman knows that. Hopefully for all the new members particularly, that one of them, I'm not trying to make excuses for our body, but one of them requires that we get the Senate to agree with us, the President to agree with us, and make a law. The other is, in fact, direct. All you have to do is order it done, and if it's not done, you find somebody new that you order to have it done. It is a little bit of a difference, and I'm not making excuses because I think we should have a partially done on every one of your recommendations. And speaking of people that would get a lot of that done, we now recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a semi-unprecedented recommendation that's in the middle of all this as well, and it's the Medicare Advantage Demonstration Program. GAO seems to stick its neck out last year and to say there is a program that HHS is implementing that I think the term was is outside the bounds of the statute, what they're given permission to do. And it's about an $8 billion program that you said is not only wasteful, but it's probably not even legal, though obviously you didn't make that statement. The GAO was very careful to say we're not attorneys, we're not making this recommendation about legality of it. But of all the demonstration programs that have happened since 1995, it's larger than all of them combined. You recommended and said this program is not demonstrating anything. We recommend to the administration that it be canceled. Was that program canceled?
No.
Can you determine why the program came into existence, a program that is outside of the bounds of the statute that they don't have legal authority to do, that's larger than all of the demonstration programs combined? Were you able to get an answer from the administration why they're doing this program at all?
Yeah, with the Chairman's permission, I'd like to bring up another person who wasn't sworn in.
No, absolutely.
Okay.
It's
James Cosgrove was our witness before this committee and is our expert on this matter.
just to be technical, please rise. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Let the record reflect an affirmative also, and you're in.
What is your best guess of why the administration did it in the first place?
The stated intention from the administration was that they wanted to test a way of giving plans a stronger incentive to improve their quality.
The way they had designed the program, was that possible to get that outcome?
What we determined was that it was impossible for an evaluation to be done to see whether the demonstration worked or not, which is why we recommended that the demonstration be canceled.
So they dumped $8.3 billion over 3 years into a program to demonstrate something that it's not possible to demonstrate something with. Why would they do that? They're very smart folks. Could you ever determine, did you ever get an answer back from them? We had a hearing with this committee as well to try to ask some of the same questions. Were you able to determine why they're spending this $8-point-some-odd billion?
What we have is simply their stated reason for doing the demonstration. This is also in the context that Congress passed and the President signed into law provisions that would have given plans an incentive to increase their quality. CMS, instead of implementing those provisions, set those aside and implemented the demonstration program instead.
We're still, in this report that we're talking about today, recommending that this demonstration be canceled. There's still $2 billion that hasn't been spent yet that the Congress could act to stop the demonstration.
Correct. So Medicare Advantage was to be cut based on the existing law that's sitting out there, the Affordable Care Act, I assume is what you're talking about when you talk about the law that's been passed. There was a reduction in the Affordable Care Act. That reduction was replaced with this demonstration program appropriately right before last year's election to sustain it over 3 years, and then it goes away at that point. So we're still trying to figure out where they came up with $8 billion to be able to move into a program that everyone said this is not legal, and that everyone has said this is wasteful. It's not actually you can't do a demonstration project that doesn't demonstrate anything and be able to just insert money into the process on that. We're still dealing with the same dynamic here. Now we have $2 billion left. The full recommendation is continue to cut this off for next year because it's not actually accomplishing anything. Is that correct?
Yes.
There's also the Medicaid portion of this as well, deal with the uncompensated care. Can we go through a little bit of those recommendations also? Because you made some pretty strong recommendations on that. This is a high-risk area and has been for a while.
Carolyn Yoakum, please, if I might indulge the committee.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Let the record reflect another yes.
Thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the recommendations that are there for uncompensated care reimbursement from Medicaid going to the states. What was the recommendation?
One of the main recommendations had to do with the way that states calculate their disproportionate share payments and the use of supplemental payments. In general, the issue that there's several issues. One of the main points is getting some transparency and some accountability to how states are managing these payments. We have also suggested that Congress requires CMS to take 3 broad actions. First, to improve the state reporting of these supplemental payments. Secondly, to clarify the methods of calculating how these payments will be made. And then thirdly, to require independent audits of these payments.
Are there some states that are more prone to these supplemental payments than others?
That is a difficult question to answer because we don't have the full picture of all the supplemental payments that are out there.
But the nature of these payments has grown over the years quite extensively. Right. Correct, Carolyn? Yes.
But at this point, we don't even know which states are more open to this or using it more often than others, even be able to get that level of information from CMS.
We really don't. What we know is that reporting on these payments is improving, but it's still not 100%. And we know that from 2010, there was $32 billion, and in 2011, it's up to $43 billion. So they are on the rise.
Yeah, basically, I believe in this area that Congress will need to act to require CMS to take these actions, and I believe it's appropriate. There's a lot of money at stake here, and there's not a proper amount of transparency and accountability.
Thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We now go to the very timely gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Dorado, I was particularly interested in the portion of the report which deals with the need for better collaboration between the VA and the DOD in their delivery of health care services. I think a lot of folks in the civilian community think that it's the same population, and oftentimes it's not. For example, the VA has not had to deal with combat veterans giving birth before, but since Iraq and Afghanistan, we actually now have female veterans of childbearing age, and yet that care is not available on the VA side. So being able to go to DOD for that care will actually cut down costs as opposed to sending them to civilian providers. I was especially interested in your discussion about improving the exchange of electronic health records between DOD and VA. And I was hoping that you could perhaps elaborate and summarize that, because they are the 2 systems. We do have in Illinois and also in Georgia 2 joint DOD-VA facilities that are supposed to be becoming a single system, and they're really not. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. I find this area very perplexing. Mr. Williamson's been following it for many, many years, and I'd like him to provide. He'll give you a thorough answer.
Congresswoman, in 2011, the DOD and VA secretaries agreed that they were going to pursue a unified single system for veterans and active duty personnel. Unfortunately, just this past February, they elected to no longer pursue that route, and they now are going back to trying to have interoperable exchange of information between the major two systems. We testified on this in late February and expressed concern about the lack of a plan to do that and how they are actually going to carry it out. Not the least to say is the amount of time that's passed and the money that was spent in trying to develop that single system, which has now been set aside, and they're going back to their original plans of trying to go with the two systems.
What was the reason for going with the two different systems?
At the February hearing, the DOD and VA witnesses said that they thought they could do it in a more cost-effective manner by continuing with the two systems. However, when pressed on that, they said the analysis of that was not yet complete. So we'll have to wait and see whether the conclusion of that analysis bears that out or not.
I think the analysis also ought to include an analysis of using one of the two systems that they currently have and just going with it, and having the other agency adopt that system as well. I mean, this has gone on way too long. I think a lot of people, both veterans and military, active duty military, deserve a better system, and it's possible. It's not the technical difficulties aren't the problem here. It's a management decision, and there needs to be some action taken. I would encourage the Congress to have active oversight over this issue until there's a satisfactory resolution.
Am I correct in my understanding that between the two systems, the VA's VISTA system and the DOD's ALTA system, the VISTA system is generally perceived to be the better system, but we are not abandoning ALTA? Is that understanding correct?
ALTA is not being abandoned at this time. That is correct.
But it is not. But the VISTA system is superior. Is that from the practitioner's point of view? Those who have to use it.
I'd hesitate to come to that generalization. It depends on the user population you're talking to. But as a generic conclusion, most would probably agree with your statement.
So then if we were to go with what you just said, Mr. Dorado, as a recommendation, which is just use one of the two instead of trying to build a whole third one, which is even more expensive, how do we go about doing that? Is it a requirement from the White House? It is Congress saying that you will use one of these two systems? That seems to be meddling down to a level in the services that we may not want to get into.
Yeah, well, my recommendation would be for the Congress to ask for the analysis that supports their current decision, and ask for that analysis to be expanded to include the pros and cons of going to one of the two other systems, and to see at that point what the proper decision would be. And if the Congress then is not satisfied with that decision, it can legislate.
Do you think that in their testimony, well, they're saying it's too expensive to develop a new system, and they're going back to the two. Is it because they were each counting the money that each was spending and not the cumulative between the two together? Do you see what I'm saying?
Clarify one thing. When the 2011 decision was made to go to a unified system, it was not necessarily stated that they would develop a brand new one. In fact, we assumed they would default to one of the existing ones from a cost perspective. So I just want to clarify that for you.
Thank you. I think this goes back to Mr. Chairman, what he's been working on with the purchase of software, and I yield back my time.
Gentlelady's time has expired. We will now yield our time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question. You used a term there, and before I get to record, you talked about it depending on the population it was using. Is that just a very nice way of saying that this is the one I'm trained on, so I like it better?
Yeah, and depending on the practitioners.
Right. So basically, we're not talking cost, we're not talking effective. We're just saying, I was trained on this, I like this better. We're not looking at a big picture. Correct. I think that right there may have summed up the entire hearing that's really concerning me, is we're looking at what we like. We're looking at what we are trained on. And in many of these departments, but I appreciate the way you said that. It's a very nice way of saying it, but basically, I like what I'm doing and I don't want to change.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. An overview question here. One is I was looking over this report, which are always fascinating. As a boy from North Georgia growing up, I didn't realize catfish needed that much inspection. But I usually just caught them. I inspected them and said, yep, that's a good one. Put it in the bucket. We're good. an overview question here. What's the greatest problem? And it may not be an easy answer. Fragmentation, duplication, or overlap?
Well, of the three, we typically find most of it in the overlap area.
Okay.
Among those three options, I would say.
Okay. Going back to the reality of what you had commented on earlier, I was reading in the report on page 211, and it came to the checked baggage screening, TSA. And this one really disturbed me as we were going along. And basically your report says the TSA has not yet conducted a study to determine about the 90% cost share. And it went on and actually stated this. It said that it generally applies to the reimbursable agreements of the checked baggage. Absent direction from Congress, that TSA conduct a study, the agency currently has no plans to do so.
That's correct. TSA was actually mandated to do that study back in 2004. They attempted to do the study in 2006, but they really couldn't reach consensus. Some of the issues they were grappling with was what was the appropriate Federal role in terms of paying for these systems. They also couldn't reach consensus on who benefited the most. Was it the Federal Government? Was it the traveling public? Was it the airports? Because there are significant benefits to the airports themselves in terms of fewer bags being lost and stolen. So they couldn't reach consensus, so they decided just to stay with the 90% cost share. And they identified that they wouldn't review that again unless Congress directed it.
Okay. Again, shouldn't the appropriate role of any Federal agency, stewards of taxpayer dollars, be to run the most efficient, most productive organization that they can and not to bog down in what-if scenarios?
Yeah, we agree. We think they need to tackle this issue. We think they need to look at it. There's opportunities for savings here. Also related to checked baggage, we also identified that if TSA deployed more of these inline systems, they could achieve significant savings just in reduced personnel costs.
Well, I think it's very disturbing that they had a mandate to do it. It shows that they found problems and stopped. And it's a story here almost like my child. When my child wants, I tell him to do something, he says, well, it's hard, Daddy, I don't want to do it. So we give up. This is the part that most Americans don't understand and they don't get when we come to this. Moving along, page 41, the uniform procurement. As a member of the Air Force, this one is just a general member. It's like any new, and with no offense to my higher-up generals, it's like the new general comes along, we need a new uniform. That's crazy. And especially when we're doing, is this a service branch issue? And I agree with my colleague here, not wanting to meddle, but why do we come along and looking at the cost of production? I'm still trying to figure out why it took $400,000 to redo the Navy uniform when they actually look like the others. When I'd have done it for a lot less than that, because it's the same pattern. What can we do there? Or is there anything we can do there to continue this process? I know the Air Force has now decided that they will use something with the Army, but they're not really sure what they can use. I can use a lot of examples here of people that didn't like the new ones and really a force protection issue here. Can you elaborate on that real quickly?
Yes, I definitely think there is more that the Department of Defense can do. It has a board that is responsible for establishing policies and procedures with regard to uniforms and managing this whole process. And there are a couple of issues. One is certainly from a cost perspective. The Defense Logistics Agency will waive a fee if two services go together and procure uniforms. And that is really probably just the tip of the iceberg here in terms of potential cost savings, because there could be further efficiencies and economies of scale if two services are purchasing uniforms. I think a lot of this, again, stems to each service has their own culture, each service has their own acquisition process, and it is often easier for them to be able to go their own route, do their own testing, and develop a uniform exactly to their own specifications. But particularly in a joint environment, there are also security and safety risks. If you have people in a combat environment with different types of uniforms, different camouflage patterns.
I've experienced that in Iraq. And real quickly, and I'm out of time, but are personnel costs, I know you look at the cost of the program savings, but are personnel like elimination or others included in your potential cost savings or streamlining?
It depends on which of the options we're talking about.
Okay, and I will have some questions I will provide after, because I would like some answers on that.
I'd be happy to talk to you more about it. But I'd just say on one point, this combat uniform issue, if you look at many of our other options, there are much more expensive examples of what's happening here with unmanned aircraft systems, electronic warfare. There's huge opportunities there to be more efficient in the Department.
Well, thank you for your work. I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Dodaro, good to see you again. Thank you for your agency's work. I have a technical question first, just on the report itself. Once you do a review of an agency, I'm reading through here, sometimes an agency comments, sometimes they don't respond at all. What is the requirement on an agency to respond to the GAO's recommendations?
Yeah, there's really no requirement. We give them an opportunity in accordance with our procedures and our generally accepted auditing standards, provide them an opportunity to comment. There's no mandatory requirement that they do so.
Yeah, that seems like a fundamental flaw in the process as well. As a former State legislator, if you do an audit or a review of an agency, at a minimum that agency should respond to those recommendations to say whether, and again, sometimes they agree, sometimes they explain further why there may be an overlap or duplication, and sometimes they don't respond at all, which to me, if they're not responding at all, that's completely being unresponsive.
I don't disagree with you at all on that. And two things I would say. One is it's relatively rare when they don't. Usually they do, and they'll agree or disagree. Sometimes they'll comment on our findings but not on the recommendations. If I think it's a significant issue, I try to meet with the heads of the agencies and talk them through those issues. But by and large, we get good comments and good cooperation because they know it's in their interest.
Okay. So let me turn specifically to the higher education assistance portion. And another technical question is, you say here that as of April 9th, GAO has not been able to assess the 213 areas identified. What does that mean?
Let me ask Barbara. Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, we need to have her sworn in, please, if I might.
Thank you. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you, ma'am. You may take your seat. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative.
My name is Barbara Boberg. I'm the Managing Director for Education, Workforce, and Income Security Issues. And we wanted to discuss higher education assistance because there are three different kinds of assistance out there. There's grants, like the Pell Grants. There's student loans, loans to students and parents. And there's tax benefits. And these are not necessarily well coordinated. There are programs in education, in the Veteran Affairs Department, in DOD that assist students with education. There's multiple tools for different situations. They don't all get used. There's not a lot of coordination across agencies.
So but on this report it shows an A next to completion. What does that mean?
You're talking about the STEM program, I'm thinking.
No, it says Area 16, Higher Education Assistance. It says if it's fully enclosed, it's been addressed. If it's half enclosed, it's partially. And then there's a thing that says A, as of April 9th, 2013, we have not assessed the 2013 areas identified.
Oh, okay. It's because it's a new issue, it's really not addressed. That's a footnote A. That means it's a brand new issue, and so that they haven't had a chance to implement it yet.
Okay. So let me ask my question specifically, and you pointed out the three agencies, actually 4 different Federal agencies that administer Federal aid. On one of them, the report states that in 2009, 1.5 million taxpayers failed to file for an education credit for which they were eligible. Have the Treasury and Education Departments taken any steps to improve the public's knowledge of these education tax credits, to your knowledge?
As in many areas, they are starting to think about this. We had suggested that they look at the demographics, at the characteristics of the households and individuals who were eligible but didn't file. We also asked that they improve the information to them. People don't well understand how these programs work. They also don't understand how the Federal aid programs work generally. So the application, the FAFSA that you fill out for Federal financial assistance, even though there has been an effort on the Department of Education to streamline that and to pre-populate it with IRS information, it can be difficult and tedious for people to fill out, and people don't. And so there are people who not only don't get to take advantage of the tax benefits that could accrue for education expenditures, but there are doubtless people who don't apply for benefits for which they would be qualified and perhaps do not get the education to which they may be entitled.
Yeah, and obviously that's troubling at a time when the costs for education are going up. Madam Chair, I know my time has expired. I don't know if the time of her having to be sworn in counts against me or if I get any extra time or not.
I will grant the gentleman additional time.
Thank you. On the improper payments in the VA's comprehensive post-9/11 GI Bill program, apparently that quadrupled between 2009 and 2010, and your report recommends that the Department of Ed share best practices with the VA and the Department of Defense. In what ways do you recommend that collaboration occur?
Well, one of the issues when this program was first implemented was how to get improper payments back. And if the funding is going to the schools, it's much easier to get things back because we have institutional relationships, and there are a number of people getting funding via the school. We can withhold money. We can do different things to get that money back. It's much more difficult when it goes to the individual. And this was something that was really a little bumpy at the beginning of the post-9/11 GI Bill implementation. And we felt that the Department of Education has for many years run grant programs and loan programs for students in higher ed, and that they might have been able to help with certain common practices that are used. Now, in the VA's defense, they have begun talking to the Department of Education. I don't want to hold out the education programs as being perfect by any means, but certainly there's a level of experience and lessons learned from many years of practice that could help.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And now the Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bentivolio.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My question deals with the combat uniforms. Now, let's see, just for clarification's sake, the two uniforms we went from was desert camo and forest BDU, if I'm not mistaken. BDU mean battle dress uniform, correct?
Yes. Yes, we went from 2 to 7 different uniforms.
So these are
different patterns.
Right. These are not Class A's. They're not dress whites. These are everyday wear working uniforms, correct?
Yes, correct.
Great. That's what I thought. And we went from, if I'm not mistaken, the difference between in the old forest green camouflage from a Marine and an Army was the name of the branch, upper right-hand pocket, and I think the Marines wore their sleeves differently than the Army, correct?
Again, there have been a number of changes made over the years.
Number of changes. Now we have 7. We have the blue digital, Navy, Air Force, Marine brown digital, Army gray greenish digital, and do we have a special camouflage? I'm trying to find the other 3. 4.
There are pictures of them all in our report. Let me get the page. What's the page?
Okay. Well, I'll look at that.
Yeah, we have them all pictures of them in the report.
All right. And but I think I saw $82 million savings if we reduced it to 1.
Right. That would be the savings estimated, for example, if the Army and the Air Force go together in designing a new uniform. And the savings that we're reporting, these are the savings because the Defense Logistics Agency, which procures uniforms for all the services, will waive their initial inventory fee if 2 or more services join together in a procurement of a same uniform.
And that was the $82 million that I read?
Yeah.
So what is your estimate of the cost savings, for instance, if we went to just 1 digital uniform?
We don't have a specific cost estimate.
Okay, but it would be considerable.
It would probably be significantly more because we would expect that there would be economies of scale in the procurement of the uniforms as well as some savings in the design and acquisition.
And the only difference would be the name of the branch and possibly the way they wear their sleeves or their hat would tell the difference, correct?
Right. Each service has to look at their mission and determine where do you need pockets, how much material do you have to carry, and those kinds of things. So that is why the current Department of Defense guidance does not require all the services to have the same uniform, but it highly encourages them to explore opportunities to partner together and see if they can reach compromises and work through the requirements.
Okay. So when you said cargo pockets, I mean, it's my understanding a cargo pocket on your leg has got to be big enough to fit an MRE. So an MRE is eaten by all branches.
Right. That's correct. But again, looking at the services' different missions, they may be carrying different types of equipment and want to modify things a little bit.
Okay.
So that's where some of the individual requirements come from.
Has there been any studies on exactly what the cost savings would be if we went to one uniform?
No. We checked with the Department of Defense, and we do not think that we do not think that they have identified or done any particular studies. So again, our analysis was based on the Army and Air Force going together and the inventory fees that could be saved.
$82 million. Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Would the gentleman yield? One quick follow-up. In this year's statement, you talked about the uniforms. Obviously, the branch is buying additional uniforms. Have you ever looked into the aborted program to consolidate non-uniformed service personnel in combat, their uniforms? Apparently, they've repeatedly had these studies to try to come up with sort of what, when I visit Afghanistan or Iraq, civilians, other employees, the press, they're in haphazard different uniforms, sometimes sort of camouflage. I've become aware of it on multiple occasions that apparently they keep getting ready to design one, and then they can never get buy-in from the services. Did that fit at all into sort of this not invented here, I won't buy an Army solution even for civilians?
We focused on the service uniforms for military officials in this study, so we haven't looked specifically at that issue.
Okay. Thank you. I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you and Mr. Cummings for holding this hearing. I think this is one of the most important hearings we have every year, but I guess it's not sexy looking at the press table. And yet, when we think about the potential for savings—
Would the gentleman yield?
I would.
You cannot insult the esteemed members of the press who are here. I would like to personally thank the esteemed members of the press who saw the importance of this.
That's right. The honor weem. But thank you for being here. I just wish more of your colleagues understood how important, actually, this topic really is. General Dodaro, you had 381 recommendations, and thank you to you and your able staff for this very illuminating report. You had 381 recommendations since 2011, I think. What's the total estimated ballpark figure of savings to the government if all 381 were implemented?
The estimate we have is tens of billions of dollars. We don't have a specific estimate.
Well, actually, it's a lot more than that. I'm going to get to one of them, tax collection. But I mean—
Well, yeah, if you close the tax gap, you could,
Yeah.
Right.
And improper payments.
Right. Yeah.
There's another $125 billion a year. So,
we're being very conservative.
You really are.
Yeah.
I mean, because this committee actually has explored just those two items, and they exceed $500 billion a year, just those two.
Which?
Well, the tax gap.
Well, the tax gap's $385.
And improper payments are $125 billion a year, maybe more.
Right.
So uniforms is interesting, and certainly we should effectuate inefficiency. But when we're looking for savings, we ought to go, it seems to me, after the big stuff, and let me do that. In your looking at the tax gap, the figure from 2006 is $385 billion estimated. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's the net tax gap, right.
Net tax gap. Now, could you define for us what tax gap means?
Tax gap means the difference between taxes that are owed but not collected. For example, the voluntary compliance tax rate is about 84%. So about 84% of citizens voluntarily comply and file their taxes. And that's been that way for a number of years now. So if you think about it that way, 16% of the population is not properly filing their taxes, and that can include companies as well. The tax gap is really widely distributed across both corporations and individuals and different types of taxes.
And in fact, you went into that, General, in the report, saying that taxpayers' underreporting is less likely to occur when the tax information is also reported to the IRS by a third party. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. And we recommend more third-party reporting.
What does that mean?
That means getting information from other agencies outside the IRS or the particular employer of the individual. For example, there's a number of reports that are out there that show business activity of different businesses, and we've suggested IRS get those reports and compare them to the businesses that are reporting taxes to compare the data.
Okay.
The data matching aspect of this is the most efficient and effective way to spot potential problems.
And why would we be leaving $385 billion of revenue that's owed the government, not new taxes, not cutting critical investments? Why in the world would we leave $385 billion, given our fiscal crisis, on the table? But for what?
That's one of the reasons I've included it. It's been on our high-risk list for years, and I've included it in every single one of these 3 reports that we put out. I just think we're not focused enough attention.
Well, General, could it have something to do with resources at the IRS?
In some cases, resources would be helpful, but not in all cases.
What is the ROI? What's the return on investment for every dollar in collection resources we invest in IRS? Do you know?
My experts tell me they don't have good data on it.
Would at least $1.60 be in the ballpark, you think? You can get back to us.
Yeah.
You can get back to us, but if you could get that for the record.
All right.
And then I have 37 seconds. So real quickly, the Chairman and I have introduced a bill, as you know, called FITARA, in trying to streamline and make more efficient and effectuate savings in our Federal IT acquisition process. And in that bill, there is something called the working capital funds to help cloud service transitions for a period up to 5 years. Real briefly, if the Chairman will entertain it, would you comment on that provision, because I think it's consistent with some of the findings in your report?
Yes. I'll ask Mr. Williamson.
If the Chairman would allow the answer.
Of course.
I thank the Chair.
Yes, Congressman, that provision would be clearly consistent with our message in the cloud area. And that's in part why we're supportive of the bill. The bill overall includes at least 8 areas that are included in our duplication report that's issued today.
Thank you very much, and I knew the Chairman would like to hear that.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
General Dodaro, the gentleman asked about additional audit, and no question at all, I think he had an accurate known figure. But isn't it that watchdog groups and others have come up with items that would, in fact, provide data that would give you a sense of people who you can't audit because they haven't filed a return, that are in the cash or somewhat cash economy? Isn't that a big part of that non-reported? You know, the 84% is who you audit, but the 16% would be the ones you're not auditing, right?
Well, it could be. It could be the ones you're not auditing. I agree with you.
Has the IRS ever audited someone who didn't file taxes?
Well, only if they would get a tip or something from somebody that indicates that they're a non-filer in that area. But there are other things that, like we recommend that Congress give IRS math authority so they could fix some of these returns when they come in. It doesn't cost any additional money. We recommend that IRS, in our most recent report, redirect some of their resources from auditing lower income taxes returns to higher income taxes. They get more ROI back on the money that they spent. Same amount of resources they'd have auditing different types of tax returns yields more revenue back to the IRS. So we have a long list of recommendations in this area that we think could be implemented without additional resources that would yield greater revenues to the government.
Okay. I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on this important topic. And as I've just come back from the district, this particular issue continues to come up over and over again. The hardworking American taxpayers have a hard enough time paying for something once, but paying for it twice is really a problem. And so I want to focus a little bit on something that was put in your GAO report on renewable energy initiatives. And I've got an energy background going back some 35 years ago, and as we looked at that initiative, federal spending over a 7-year period from 2002 to 2008 averaged about $4 billion a year and increased in 2010 to some $15 billion. And in quoting you, we found, this is a quote, we found that federal support for renewable energy is fragmented, as 23 agencies and their 130 sub-agencies implemented hundreds of initiatives in fiscal year 2010. We assessed that the Federal Wind Energy Initiative found that there were 82 wind-related initiatives that we examined that had overlapping characteristics. And so my question is this. In 2012, the GAO found that there were 700 government initiatives to promote renewable energy. And the report finds that there was overlapping initiatives throughout this entire area. Would it be safe to say that the Obama administration's spending on renewable energy is lacking coordination?
I would say that this has been a problem even before the Obama administration in terms of the number of initiatives we have out there. Just to go out and do the inventory and come up with those numbers was a huge effort on our part. We couldn't go out and go to one source. You would think you could go to the Department of Energy and get that number, right? But the Department of Energy is one of those agencies involved in dealing with renewable energy initiatives. And we have, in the body of the work that we've worked on energy issues for a long time, this has been an issue going back as long as I've worked in the area in the early 1990s.
Okay. Well, let me follow. Okay, go ahead.
It's also fair to say that a number of those initiatives were enacted by Congress as well, that they weren't just administration initiatives. It's a mixture of both.
Well, but let's look at the coordination. If this was a problem and we had a problem with coordination, why would we increase the spending by 400% because we take an inefficient program and make it more inefficient?
I don't think we spoke to the efficiency of the particular initiatives. There are a lot of initiatives out there, and some of them, some initiatives, some projects may benefit from multiple sources. What we're trying to point out is that does anybody have a sense of all these different initiatives, as the Comptroller General mentioned, established by Congress, many of them, both on the tax side, the tax expenditure side, which tends to have the least amount of transparency, as well as program initiatives that every administration puts forward.
But I think this goes back to Chairman Iss's point, too, about the visibility over these things. Nobody really had visibility over it. Nobody's responsible for focusing in on this. And if it wasn't for us going in and identifying this, nobody would know how many programs there were.
Basically, if it's green, it's good, and that's what and that's why I wore my tie today, to make sure that. But as we look at this, let's go on a little bit further. Then, how much cost savings could we achieve if we resolve this coordination problem? I mean, what are we looking at?
Yeah,
700 government initiatives.
Yeah, that's very hard to say because we think that there could be some cost savings, but there also could be greater efficiencies, more effective programs. So it's a combination of those two things. The first step is to figure out what all these initiatives are. And even though we did those numbers, in 2011 they're going to change, in 2012 they're going to change, in 2013 they're going to change because initiatives are coming in and going out. So it's very difficult to get a sense of this snapshot every time. There's a huge amount of our resources just to figure out and identify those 700 initiatives.
And so those are changing on a regulatory basis because Congress is not changing it from year to year.
Well, there are programs being implemented and different emphasis on various programs within the government. So,
from a regulatory standpoint?
I think it's a combination of changes in the tax code. We have different tax codes that may be expiring and being renewed. Some are renewed, some aren't. So there's a changing landscape, and then agencies are making decisions on what to emphasize.
All right, I'm running out of time. Let me ask one last question here. As we've seen that there's been quite a bit of malfeasance uncovered within the administration in terms of spending on green energy over the last 2 years. And as we see this, a lot of it coming from the Department of Energy, what energy efficiency programs do you find most concerning out of those 700 government initiatives?
Well, there's a lot of work we've done in the energy sector. I would say when we looked at the loan guarantee program, we had some concerns about documentation of that program. But by and large, our main concern was just bringing forth the notion that no one had a good sense of how many different initiatives there were and was there good coordination.
So if you were to eliminate 3, I can see my time has expired. Would the Chair yield for one
Ask unanimous consent. The gentleman have an additional 30 seconds. Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. As we see this, if you were to put 3 programs that if you had a magic wand you could make disappear and save the hardworking American taxpayers' money, what 3 programs would those be?
We haven't identified programs that we would eliminate, and I mean, ultimately, that's Congress's decision in terms of policies. What I would say is if we want to make changes in green energy, renewable energy, we have to address the question and the issue of fossil fuels, which we're very heavily dependent on, both for transportation and less so in the electricity sector, and recognize that we picked those because they are most cost-competitive sources of energy. And to force changes through government interaction is just one piece of that. And we have to really get an understanding of what government role should play. Should it be in the R&D sector? And those are policy decisions that are made by the Congress.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Chairman, I yield back.
What are you yielding back? Thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is always an important hearing, but it also is more of the same, and I want to suggest, ask a question concerning approach. The gentleman before me spoke of coordination. I want to speak of consolidation. I think both are important, but it is in the nature of government, Mr. DeBarro, that we are going to have functions that overlap, even duplicate, because we have 12 appropriations subcommittees, and they are pretty independent. We have many more authorization committees and subcommittees. And so it is in the nature of the beast that they are going to put out duplicate programs. There comes a point when one has to look at those programs and say, make the kind of evaluation, a very helpful evaluation you have made. May I say how much I appreciate that a part of your report opens with a definition of the differences between fragmentation and overlap and duplication, although I do note that you still lump them all together in the text, and yet there is a tremendous difference, considering, for example, that you could easily have programs that are fragmented because it's too early to put them together, or that overlap for reasons that would be perfectly sensible. But at some point, if they are to be retained, one has to ask the questions that the GAO has asked. So I went out to get from staff the latest version of an attempt to consolidate. In other words, an approach that would try to take this and keep it from having a revolving door aspect, as I think you will find the next time the Appropriation Committee comes out with yet another proposed provision. Now, the President in 2012, early 2012, submitted a proposal to consolidate some agencies within the trade-related sector. Now, I put aside the sector. That's really not my question. As I recall, we had a hearing on that. That did not move forward. It seemed to be fairly compelling, so I went looking for the letter, because it was focused on business and trade, and it indicated that it was difficult for firms, and especially small business, to get assistance And so the proposal was to have one phone number, one mission, and it was said that this would help business succeed and support a competitiveness, exports, job creation. Now, of course, that's all description. We'd have to see if that would happen. But does there not come a point when GAO itself, perhaps, might suggest a more comprehensive approach than simply pointing out the pockmarks and hoping that somebody will pick them up? The President hasn't had this authority since Ronald Reagan. My question goes to the authority. Do you think that, given the nature of the problems you continue to uncover on an annual basis, that some of them might be eliminated through consolidation of some of the functions themselves?
Yes, in certain areas we've recommended that. For example, we've looked at the loan programs at HUD and at agriculture in the rural housing area. In fact, HUD's giving as many loans in rural communities as the Rural Housing Authority is in urban counties. And so
how would you consolidate there?
Well, you'd put the two agencies together. You could locate them at HUD. HUD has a more extensive network. You could create another entity. I mean, there are different options for how to do it, but where we have identified that opportunity, we have pointed that out in those areas. And I might say, as it relates to the scope of our work, I mean, we were mandated by Congress to have a routine set of audits and annual reports that outlined duplication across federal government agencies. I mean, that's why we're issuing these products. In some cases, you can do some consolidation, of course, and where we think it's appropriate, we have pointed it out.
Well, I appreciate that you pointed it out, because there is a kind of repetitive nature to this report. And the problem, I'm not bothered by the repetitive nature. I'm bothered by the fact that the next appropriation cycle is going to dump equal amounts of uncoordinated and unconsolidated, even, of course, programs. This particular one didn't move forward. I never was able, frankly, to get a view, because we never got that deeply into it. But it does suggest that, and by the way, only the Congress can give the President that authority. Isn't that not the case?
That's correct.
Finally, could I ask you
Would the gentlelady yield for a second? Your question's a good one, but if we perhaps could ask it both ways. We can give them the authority, but of course the President can either get the authority to do something he hasn't asked for, or he can ask for reorganization specific and then get that bill from the Congress. Either one is allowed.
He can either ask for it or...
As you were alluding to, since Ronald Reagan, off and on, there has been reorganization authority. But Congress has the actual right, and we abrogate our rights when we give reorganization authority. On the other hand, if the administration asked for a reorganization that he had planned and said, I'd like to do this, this, and this, then in fact he'd be asking Congress to pass a bill, and he would send us a draft bill. The two are rather interesting differences, and the only reason I mention that is every time Congress sends a proposal for effectively reorganization, the administration, we could, sua sponte, pass a bill and send it to the White House, or the President could say, I like parts of this, I don't like parts of this, and ask for it. But I think the gentlelady's point is good. Without a reorg, without real change in the organization, you will probably not have full implementation of these at all.
Indeed, it's a very important point that the Chairman makes. And I note that the President asked for fast-track authority, because once you do it by saying here are a set of agencies, then what you do is to get members who, for reasons of their own, perhaps that function is in the member's district or in the member state, pick and choose, and they pick the bill apart. So the experience has been that if you don't give the President the authority in some kind of fast-track way, the way we do with trade itself, the notion of consolidation becomes just that, a notion. So I just wanted to get on the record that that would be a way a way we haven't used in some time to deal with the overlapping, or I don't even want to use that word because my next question is going to be, is there a way to unbundle how much of it has been fragmentation, how much of it has been overlap, because you appear to understand and want us to understand the difference. In this graph that you have on page 2, that speaks of what fragmentation means, what overlap means, and what duplication means, and that's the final, somebody needs to go with the duplication.
The gentlelady's time has expired, but please answer.
Right. I mean, we can segregate that out, but I'd make a very important point. We're just not reporting fragmentation to say things are fragmented. We are only pointing out areas of fragmentation where we believe there to be inefficiencies.
No, I understand that.
Because you're right. I mean, we could point out a wide range of things that are fragmented but are not necessarily leading.
No, and I appreciate that. This involves the analysis that shows that there is underlying problem.
Right. But we could identify that, recognizing in some areas there are both fragmentation and overlap and duplication. So there's elements of some elements of 3 of them in several different areas, but we can attempt to isolate those and provide the committee with a listing.
If you would do that.
I'd appreciate it.
The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to continue this conversation with the opportunity, I hope, to not only ask you questions, Mr. Dodaro, but also our chairman and the delegate because of their longtime experience on this committee. Has there ever been a joint reorganization council in the Federal Government between the executive and legislative branch?
There has probably, the Hoover Commission probably would be the huge success story where it was long-term, ongoing, and bought in by all the bodies. Most recently, I think the Homeland Security stand-up would be a major reorganization where the administration came to us, said what they wanted in this new entity, and then we passed a bill. Those would be the 2 most current examples, one doing it one way, one doing it the other.
Do they work better if they're topical, or can you do something broader than a consolidation on one topic?
I think that's where somebody has to come up and talk about the success of Hoover, because it is the poster child for how you do it right.
If I could have Mr. Mem come up and be sworn in.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, sir.
Let the record indicate the witness answered in the affirmative.
Well, first, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for raising the Hoover Commission. I mean, it's music to my ears as a management geek there. The reorganizations that work best are those in which the Congress is deeply involved at the outset in making sure that they understand what the proposals are going to be, what will be done, and how it will be done. One of the concerns that I know various members raised, as regards to the last reorganization proposal that came in from the administration, was that they hadn't been brought in at an early enough point to understand the implications of this. And it doesn't mean that at the end of the day that it couldn't all have been resolved. But the experience, as the Chairman has mentioned, of the Hoover Commission, of where you get the Congress and where you get the administration, supplemented by outside experts that can help them on that, deciding on an approach, whether it be comprehensive or on an agency-specific approach such as the Department of Homeland Security, getting them all working together is really the best way to do it.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I want to follow up with this line of questioning then. How long has it been since the Hoover Commission completed its work? Is it a...
You weren't born, young lady.
It's been a while, yes, ma'am.
Is it time? Is it time to do it again?
There's certainly it's given the current fiscal crisis, given how difficult the set of policy questions are that Congress confronts, given the track record of our overlap, duplication, and fragmentation efforts, it's certainly maybe worthwhile to step back and say, do we have the right organization in shape here for a 21st century government? Technology has changed fundamentally in the way we can deliver services, and yet the basic institutional structure of Federal agencies, the way they deliver programs, has not changed in generations. In some cases, we have agencies that were put together to deliver services for an earlier time, an earlier client base. that continuously needs to be refreshed. Whether or not we do it on a big, broad commission or do it on a case-by-case basis is a different question, but certainly we need to be reviewing not just the increments, but the base of government in the current environment.
Now, was the Hoover Commission created by Congress?
I will have to.
Technically, yes.
Thank you. I'll take the Chairman's.
And with the assent and participation of the executive branch?
Right.
Yeah, it was actually presidentially asked for, authorized, and then included all of them. And do you remember how many years between the beginning and the end? It was huge. Hoover 1 and Hoover 2.
It was Hoover 1 and Hoover 2. I'll have to refresh the history on that, but it's, there were a number of years there. I mean, there have been other attempts. There was the Ash Council and other councils that have, President Nixon, of course, had a huge effort. President Carter had a reorganization effort that was attempted. But there really hasn't been a zero-based one. The closest we came to that was in recent memory has been the National Performance Review under President Clinton, of course. But that really wasn't a big reorganization. That was about improving effectiveness of government with some reorganization elements.
And did the Clinton administration performance reviews improve performance?
Overall, when we looked at, we've done a number of reviews of the 380 so recommendations that they made. We thought they were sensible recommendations. They certainly, one of their big achievements, I think, was whether or not we give the NPR credit for this, was bringing a focus to customer service within many Federal agencies. Agencies hadn't been familiar with thinking of the public in which they deal with as customers that have a right to polite, fast, and efficient and effective service. Certainly, one of the other pieces that was put in place during the National Performance Review era, but it was a congressional initiative, was the Government Performance and Results Act. Congress, of course, has modernized that within the last couple of years to try and get agencies to do a better job in setting long-term goals, annual performance goals, measuring performance, and most importantly, and this was the thing that we haven't done since the first GPRA was passed in 1993, and a point of personal frustration for me, is to begin to get agencies to do a better job in using that performance information in order to improve performance. We produce volumes of information and data on how programs are doing. We do a very poor job across government in using that information to pinpoint improvement opportunities, following up on making changes, and then following up rigorously to see if those changes were actually effective. And if they were, let's leverage them. If they're not, then let's go to something else.
I thank the gentleman and the Chairman.
And just for the record, the Hoover Commission was officially named the Commission when it was organized by the executive branch, and the body was appointed by Harry S. Truman. But it went on through Hoover 1 and Hoover 2 throughout the Eisenhower administration. And I believe it's the last one that was essentially chaired by a former president. Is that right? And perhaps that is the hallmark difference between it and other notables. With that, we go to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for trying to continue to call attention to this staggering problem. And I want to, first of all, commend Mr. Dodaro and his colleagues. I suppose you could say that I'm hopeful but not optimistic. It seems to me that we've allowed the Federal Government to get so big and so bureaucratic that it just is out of control, and these problems just continue. In fact, the Washington Examiner story today says government overlap and duplication have dogged the Federal Government for years. President Reagan formed the Grace Commission to identify examples of the problem, and President Clinton assigned to Vice President Gore the task of ending it by, quote, reinventing government. But the new GAO report makes clear that the examples continue to pile up. And then I was given this a short time ago from a report, and it says, quote, the last major study of Federal surveying and mapping nearly 40 years ago found a disturbing proliferation and duplication of activity among many different agencies. Today, these activities are found among an even greater number. And that was from a 1973 report 40 years ago. And you know, it's really sad. I mean, you have done you and your colleagues have done what I think is an absolutely great job finding all these examples. The Justice and Treasury Department's forfeiture programs lost $2.2 billion in 2011 because agencies cannot find a way to share storage facilities. Drug abuse prevention programs are strewn over 76 programs, costing taxpayers $4.5 billion. The Veterans Administration, which seems to feel that they're immune from efforts to save money or immune from criticism because we all love veterans, but I think there's waste and inefficiency even in the VA, and your report says it could save $1.2 billion by consolidating employment training programs. And contractors for the Defense Department Foreign Language Services are run over 159 separate contracting organizations. It just goes on and on. Let me ask you this. How hopeful are you, Mr. Dodaro, that 5 years, 10 years from now we won't be coming back finding that this program is just as bad or worse? And secondly, what do you, maybe I was not able to get here for your testimony. Maybe you've covered this, but how much do you do in follow-up, like when you suggest when you suggest that the training programs could be consolidated, do you write the VA and suggest that, and then when nothing happens, do you contact them again 30 days or 60 days or 90 days later? How does that work?
First, we regularly follow up on all our recommendations on every 6-month kind of cycle. And if we don't see enough progress made by the executive branch, then we'll work with the Congress, too, to try to get them involved. Part of the issue here is that when we identify these programs and activities, they cross multiple Federal departments and agencies. And really, OMB is in the only position to help be a catalyst to look across the executive branch agencies. In my opinion, a fundamental flaw of our current organization in the executive branch and the government, notwithstanding the need to update them, as we were just talking, is there's really no accountability when multiple agencies are involved in the process. And more problems are requiring multiple agencies to be involved because of the complexity of the problem. So if we do ever get to the point of studying the government's organization, we have to deal with that fundamental issue, because no matter how you reorganize the government, there are going to be multiple agencies that are going to have to be involved, and we need a way to be able to do it. On your point about am I optimistic, I'm cautiously optimistic. My term goes to 2025. I'm hopeful that I won't be reporting all these same issues in that year, but I can tell you that it won't change unless the Congress gets involved in this process with active oversight. The only times, and I was before this committee recently in February talking about our high-risk update, and the only areas that come off the high-risk list are where you have top-level executive branch attention and Congress is relentless in its oversight. Without those two elements, I mean, particularly in this overlap and duplication area, you're not going to see very many major changes.
You probably don't want to criticize any particular department, but I would be interested to know if there is one department that more or less is worse than others, or the other side, is there one department that you feel does the best job in responding to your suggestions?
Well, first, in my opening statement, I talked about how pervasive this problem is across government. We've got recommendations in virtually all major Federal departments and agencies. I would say that the areas where there's a need for rigorous follow-up on the part of Congress is the Defense Department and CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicare Studies. I would say those two departments need attention in order to effectuate implementation of our recommendations.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. General, you've been very kind. I'm going to do a couple more questions. Is anyone else going to want a second round? Okay, seeing none, I'll be brief. Mr. Duncan just brought up a point, and you named two great names, CMS, meaning Medicare and Medicaid, Department of Defense, meaning all of what it obviously means, isn't that sort of saying that look for where the big dollars are and you look for the big savings, something that Mr. Connolly said very well? And fortunately, he said it to a national television audience that's watching it, not just the fine gentleman in the room. To that extent, when we look at those large dollars, the Department of Defense, duplication within the Department of Defense, isn't that a self-inflicted wound? Waste and duplication and fail to get information and do their job right within CMS and obviously all the Medicare funding, isn't that primarily a self-inflicted wound? And I ask that for a reason. A lot of what you did in this fine study is, as you talked about, a lot of diverse groups, fisheries and catfish and just everything under the sun. But the big dollars, the ability to reorganize DOD so that you don't have a Pentagon just as filled as it was at the height of World War II, and you try to explain why there have to be as many people in this day and age in the white-collar, non-uniform part of DOD, and the answer is because of essentially a wasteful way of management. And when you look at CMS, and we just had a hearing on $15 billion that was simply paid out in excess of what the law allowed, aren't we to a certain extent having to find ways to make them do their job better? And the question comes from, isn't that where something like the Data Act, which was passed out of this committee unanimously in the last Congress and again is going to go through a process in this Congress, isn't that part of the process create a level of transparency to where these large agencies, it becomes so transparent, particularly potentially even to watchdogs and the public, that you can get them to do their job where it's really all in their turf?
Definitely. Definitely. I am very supportive. I think that transparency is needed. I think there needs to be a statutory underpinning so it's enduring over time and there's consistency. Data standards need to be put in place. I'm very supportive of the need to have that type of legislation that would require that level of transparency. And from that, transparency can lead to better questions, can lead to better oversight, and hopefully better results.
Now, the Data Act calls for recipient reporting. In a sense, I think I heard you say that this is one of the problems with the IRS, is they're not looking at both sides of the transaction in order to find people who don't report here, but they report to Visa and MasterCard. They report to a lot of other transactions that if you looked at that, you'd realize that you're missing the very report you need. Is that basically the same thing you're looking at in the Data Act? Do you see those as the same sort of a problem that government, if they're going to audit, has to, whenever possible, get information from multiple sources in order to realize what they don't know?
No, that's definitely the case. That's definitely the case. And I think the implementation of the Recovery Act was a perfect example of how that could be used effectively to minimize fraud, waste, and abuse in programs.
Yeah. And I think for the freshmen that are here, the Recovery Board is still in business for a reason. That Congress has recognized the need for it, kept it open, kept a mission for it, because I think Congress and the GAO certainly, we've recognized that it serves a purpose of showing you can do better. Yes. General, I'm very thankful for every appearance here, but I think the discussion that, because of Mrs. Loomis, that occurred of the Hoover Commission, and she's left now, but Delegate Norton, the idea that, in fact, we have to create, and this committee is the Committee of Jurisdiction, create an environment in which Congress buys in, the executive branch buys in. To be honest, the private sector has to be included if we're going to have the kind of reorganization that in 2025 you can say, on my watch, we made it better.
I think it's imperative we do that, particularly given our fiscal precarious nature. I mean, we can't afford to continue to operate the way we're operating, and it needs fundamental reexamination. We can do better, and we have to.
And I'm going to close with one thing. The ranking member opened thanking your staff, which I will reiterate, thanking your staff. I also will, perhaps to cry in a strange way, the fact that sequestration hit your part of Congress too. And I realize that you're now doing more oversight, more investigations, more of everything you're mandated to do, and you're doing it with less. So I'd like to see that reversed as soon as possible. I don't think you lay off the auditors when you have a problem with accountability. But I want to thank you for the good work you are doing.
I appreciate
and all the men and women that work for you.
Thank you. I appreciate those kind remarks and for your support.
You will continue to have it. We stand adjourned.